I'm Greg Harris, President and CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. We are proud to participate in Giving Tuesday and are extending our involvement throughout the entire week. This global initiative invites individuals to give back and create change in their communities and in the world. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a cultural institution with a global audience. We have an enormous responsibility to our community, locally and nationally. We engage, teach, and inspire through the power of rock and roll here every day, but also through Rock Hall EDU, our education platform that reached 1 million students from over 100 countries during this critical time. We need your support to continue this great work. In addition to our massive digital outreach, it was outstanding to see so many fans returning to the museum in Cleveland this year. Together, we celebrated the legends every day at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. For those that were lucky enough to be in attendance at the 2021 induction ceremony, you saw just how powerful live music can be. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame works very hard to keep you close to the music and the legacy of the artists that you love. This week, we're going to open up our vaults and share with you never-before-seen performances and stories from the artists themselves. Please enjoy these exclusive programs and make a gift to our 2021 annual fund. Your support this week and every day allows us to continue our mission. Thank you, and long live rock.
At the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's Library and Archives, we often talk about preservation as though everyone is familiar with this large and occasionally mystifying topic. When we talk about preservation within the context of physical objects, our mantra is do no harm. We limit light exposure, we stabilize temperature and humidity, we use specially designed boxes and bags and interleaving materials to protect against air pollutants and slow down inherent chemical reactions. But everything physical has an end date. So we also do preservation digitization in order to preserve as much of the original object as possible through high-resolution scanning, digital photography, and 3D imagery. And preservation digitization means we also need digital preservation, which involves the long-term storage and accessibility of all that digital content. The Library and Archives works to ensure that long after a physical object is gone, whether it be a costume, an instrument, a photograph, or a videotape recording, such as the recorded interviews with our inductees you're about to view tonight, we can continue to share the impactful connections these objects make with fans. Digital preservation allows us to engage, teach, and inspire through the power of rock and roll, not only on site, but online, extending our reach to the entire world. When you support the Rock Hall, your gift supports all of this. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, I've never sat during one of these. Well, you're all here to get your last cent's worth out of this application fee, aren't you? Let me give you my standard disclaimer first. The standard disclaimer is that I've attended a lot of these things, panels and keynotes and various things, particularly not so much in music, but in multimedia. And they can sometimes be really boring, so first thing I usually do to at least give you the impression that it might eventually be less boring is that at the end of the program, I will allow you to ask some questions. Probably we'll leave at least 10 or 15 minutes just to ask questions about what I talked about or completely irrelevant stuff, and I'll answer whatever I feel like. And then the other thing is that if for some reason that you perceive or you get the sense as an audience member that I've gone off track here and have become somewhat indulgent or boring, I encourage you to yell out whatever it is that you think is wrong with the presentation so that I may make an adjustment rather than allow me to drone on and then complain about it later. Okay? So anyway, the topic that I've chosen, because they ask you to choose a topic whenever you do these things. They don't say, here's your topic, come do it. They say, choose a topic. So I picked this topic because I figured this give me a lot of slack here, this secret history of rock and roll. I've been in the so-called business almost 30 years, and it's been at least probably 40 years since I became aware of rock and roll. That would probably be around the time that it actually became a phenomenon. And so I've experienced a lot of things, but also I have an insider's view. and and also I am an amateur historian, so I have, on your behalf, looked beyond kind of the apparent things or the time frame that let's say the Rock and Roll Museum has chosen as the birth of rock and roll or the lifetime of rock and roll, into those roots of rock and roll, the seminal events that made it possible to have rock and roll. And the reason why I use the term seminal is because everyone knows that rock and roll wouldn't have been possible without the invention of semen. So there are a couple of tracks that there are a couple of milestone events that I want to kind of start us off on our little journey on, and then we'll touch base on these because I think there are three things that are important. Of course, music is one of the important things that goes into it, but also all of us are aware of this music because of the fact that there are media elements involved as well. There's the element that allows the music to be transcribed and duplicated and distributed to all of us so we can listen to it when we want to listen to it rather than only being able to go to live concerts where music is performed. And also the major way that we find out about these things, which is broadcast media like radio and things like that. Well, the record actually preceded radio, oddly enough. I in my own mind, got these things kind of like juxtaposed, but the record player was actually discovered, of course, by Thomas Edison, and the year was 1878 that he discovered it or got a patent on it or something like that. But see, this was almost 120 years ago, they discovered how to record sound. And it wasn't until around the turn of the century that Marconi got a patent on long-wave transmissions, which we now come to know as radio. So it wasn't until the turn of the century that radio came into the scene. And then the third element that we needed was some epiphanal musical event, something that that not only could be recorded and distributed, but actually represented the anthropological, let us say, elements that rock and roll would eventually represent. And since it's about music, I won't get into the invention of radio and the phonograph so much, but I went out to a secondhand bookstore here on Euclid Avenue looking for a little factual information. I found this, I'm sure you all have a copy of this at home, the Concert Companion, and by Robert Bagar and Louis Bianco. It must have been translated from some other language. Anyway, I've always held the belief that the first rock and roll song was Ravel's Bolero, and I suppose I have to support that contention in some way. Bolero to me is, well, Bolero to you, you probably recognize the song, or at least most people who are not classical music buffs would recognize the song because of the pivotal role that it played in the movie 10, where the little guy gets to screw a Rasta-headed Bo Derek, presumably for about 13 minutes, because that's how long the song lasts. So, or it takes them that long to get there. In any case, so that I think is a really essential element in defining this as a rock and roll song because of its close relationship to the sexual act. And so I offer that as evidence. But also the reaction that the piece of music had, it was presented in a classical context. It was so much different than what people came to regard as classical music that it resulted in something of a let us say an uproar, a revolution, something like that, all the things that we associate with the birth of rock and roll. And I'll read you a little bit. It was actually a work commissioned in 1928 by Ira Rubinstein, who was a choreographer and, I don't know, I believe it's a woman. Yeah. The noted mime, dancer, and actress. Thank you. Commissioned the work, and essentially was, you know, it was music commissioned to go along with dance. Now here's another piece of evidence I present to you, ladies and gentlemen, as proof that this was one of the first rock and roll songs because it was meant to be danced to as well. Anyway, it says that she was a tantalizing dancer, so, but that has nothing to do with the work. Ravel said to the critic, a critic of the time, whose name I can't pronounce and who you don't care about anyway. But anyway, he said, "I'm particularly desirous that there should be no misunderstanding about this work. It constitutes an experiment in a very special and limited direction and should not be suspected of aiming at achieving anything different from or anything more than it actually does achieve." In other words, even in the sphere of classical music, he was trying to lower expectations in the way that rock music often does. You know, it's supposed to be music of the people. It's supposed to have a certain elemental crudity about it. And he goes on to say, "Before its first performance, I had issued a warning to the effect that what I had written was a piece lasting 17 minutes and consisting wholly of orchestral tissue without music. Of one long, very gradual crescendo, there are no contrasts. There is practically no invention except the plan and the manner of the execution. I have carried out exactly what I intended is for listeners to take it or leave it." Does this sound like a description of rock music or what? I don't know. Anyway, he staged it initially in Europe, in Paris, I believe. And as I recall, the first musical performances, I don't have the reviews here, but first musical performances resulted in riots. People were just like, how can this be? Like there's drums going through the whole damn thing. The whole time. This incessant, monotonous bass line goes through the whole damn song. And it's only got two sections, a verse and a chorus, and they just repeat them over and over and over again until they use this what became a contemporary gimmick for creating a hook in a record. They do a little modulation at the end, you know, which hooks everyone, you know. And in any case, you know, the Europeans didn't go for this. That's why rock and roll never would have been invented in Europe. But at a certain point, the work survived, and it was eventually brought to the United States, I believe in 1929, a year later, and the reaction was completely different in the United States. It was performed at Carnegie Hall, and the effect on the Carnegie Hall audience was almost unprecedented. Even critics joined in the frantic storm of applause. Quote, "If it had been the American custom to repeat a number at a symphonic concert," said Pitt Sanborn, whoever, maybe he's related to Dave, I don't know, "Bolero would surely have been encored, even at the risk of mass wreckage of the nerves." Sanborn, ordinarily a sedate observer, himself joined in the cheering throng. He wrote, continuing on, blah, 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 blah. "After the drum has given out the rhythm, it is reiterated by solo instruments and instruments in groups, while the volume of sound increases steadily, inexorably. When it seems that human nerves can endure no more, the key shift comes to the impact of dynamite." And blah, 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 blah. Anyway, that's why I've always felt that Ravel wrote the first rock and roll song, Bolero. It's a connection with sex. It's, even to this day, it's incessant use of the drums and monotonous bass line. It's a streamlined musical approach, and the reaction that people had to it. So you see that it didn't really start with Elvis Presley like they'd have you believe here. And the basis of this talk is to fill in some of the blanks that aren't there. So let's like rock it up to the 1950s. The next most seminal events in rock and roll is when I discovered it. And that would probably have been about 40 years ago. And I came home one day. It wasn't that I was unaware of music. There was radio around all the time. And the thing about that particular period was that so-called rock and roll, or whatever would eventually become rock and roll, was intermingled or an evolutionary event from music that was sung by people like Teresa Brewer and Pat Boone and stuff like that. Like if you tuned in Bandstand on a typical day, you were just as likely to hear Johnny Mathis as you were to hear anything that resembled, quote, rock and roll, like Chuck Berry or Jerry Lee Lewis, something like that. I grew up in Philadelphia, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and Bandstand was produced in Philadelphia and eventually went all over the country, of course. But even the theme of Bandstand was not a rock song. The theme of Bandstand was an old big band song. And it was only because of that my mother would even have Bandstand on, and I would discover it when I came home one day from school, and they started going off about this guy named Elvis. And the thing about Elvis was, you know, first of all, that, you know, he was certainly a phenomenon. He was a handsome guy, this, that, and the other thing. But the fact that he did this wild kind of music, this wild kind of music that I believe was characterized by the incessant drums, the presence of the guitar as the principal instrument, and also the fact that he would do things with his voice that resembled tribal gutturalisms, let us say. That he didn't just sing the song like Pat Boone was, but he would do things like, you know, he'd make like funny grunting noises and things like that, which drove the girls wild. You know, that a guy in the context of his singing would make these animal grunting noises. And this, of course, is what he stole from all the black musicians that he'd been exposed to growing up in the South. In any case, I came home one day and Bandstand was on, probably because my mom was waiting for the Teresa Brewer songs to come on. And they were going on about this Elvis guy. Now, this didn't strike me, either from a musical standpoint or from a sociological or social standpoint, as being anything that meant much to me. As a matter of fact, I was somewhat horrified because this Elvis guy and all the people who liked him were very much like the kind of greasers who used to beat me up in school. And I thought, you know, this music has nothing for me. So rock and roll, in that sense, you know, to me meant this odd collection of Coasters records because they were funny, Chipmunks records because they were funny, and instrumental guitar records because I couldn't sing and I had a guitar. Or I managed to get my parents to give me a guitar. So to me it was all about the guitar. And this was not an inaccurate assumption. This music is always about the guitar. Because as I went through the museum today, I noticed that there are great swaths of musical history that have just been completely lost or overlooked. And the reason why is because they were characterized by synthesizers, not by guitars. Like, for instance, in the 70s, you know, like with ELP and Yes and bands like that, where the synthesizer, the Moog, became the predominant thing. You don't find a lot of those bands in here. And you also don't find, you know, Flock of Numbskulls and you know, those other band, prototypical bands of the 80s, you know, who got the Thompson Twins and things like that, you know, who also, you know, based their sound on synthesizers. These seem to be sort of like very gray or black hole areas in musical history. So rock and roll is very much about guitars, I would have to say. So I was interested in that. That's what it meant to me. So I was more interested in the benchers and the string-alongs and other sort of rock and roll songs that I could imitate with the guitar. Then the Beatles came along. Now, the Beatles didn't come along in that sort of sense. You know, we always remember it as some like big phenomenon, you know, tacked on to some like their first Ed Sullivan appearance or something like that. But they were around before that. As a matter of fact, the first time I remember hearing about the Beatles or finding anything about the Beatles, I was in the school library and I was reading Time magazine. Don't mistake that for any intellectualism on my part. I was probably killing time. And in there was a little article, one of those little one-column sidebar articles with a picture of the guys in their collarless suits, and they were talking about this big phenomenon in England and Europe called the Beatles and how popular they were. And the thing about them was, at least according to Time, was they were kind of listenable and they sounded like the Everly Brothers, but they had long hair and they dressed funny. And that was, you know, the phenomenal aspect about them. So when they finally hit in the United States, you know, the first time I heard a Beatles record on the radio, I knew it was some different sound. I didn't know who it was, but it was definitely a different thing to me. First of all, this was the first time that it wasn't about a guy or a guy fronting a band. It was about an ensemble of players, each of which was supposed to have an essential appeal of his own. So aside from the music, the way these people were packaged was like a whole new epiphanal moment in popular music history. But the thing that they did in the long run that was really important goes back to that one of those first seminal things that happened, which was the recording process. The Beatles were the first people to recognize that recording had evolved beyond its initial limitations. Now, you may or may not have asked yourself, why is every song on the radio 3 minutes long or 3.5 minutes long or whatever? In the old days, you know, it was always like 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. You would have hit songs 1 minute and 40 seconds long. And you ask yourself, well, is this, you know, like, is this a requirement of pop music? Well, the point is, if Thomas Edison had come up with a wax cylinder this long, Well, then maybe pop music songs would have been 8 minutes instead of a wax cylinder this long, which made, at least initially, popular music somewhere around 30 seconds, you know. And as they managed to go, you know, evolve through the different formats, turning that cylinder into a flat disc, they managed to expand the musical horizon up to something around 3.5, 4 minutes. And that all culminated in the 50s when they designed 5 RPM. A lot of you people don't even remember when there were 4 speeds of records, you know, and 4 different sizes. You know, when you got a record player, it had 4 different speed settings. At 78, which was records were originally, I can't tell you why. And there was 45, those were singles, and then there was this brand new thing called 33 1/3, and hardly anybody owned any of that. And then there were 16. There was 16, and 16 was usually like children's records and things with that, or the first thing that ever looked like an album, which was something the size of a 45 but had multiple bands on it. So this hard limitation, this limitation in terms of the size of the manufacturing form factor, a disc of plastic this big, or a disc of plastic this big spinning at this speed, determined how long the music was going to be. You couldn't write music longer than could be held on this piece of plastic. Now, you know, you may have all been under the impression that people were like, of their own volition, writing 3.5-minute songs. But that's not the way it was. And a combination of this and a combination of the perceived attention span of the normal human being resulted in what radio was like. And so to reinforce that, the hardware limitation, radio got into the idea of if you play 2 or 3 songs, a commercial, 2 or 3 songs, a commercial, song, commercial, song, commercial. The idea of music being an attractor to sell other products also came in to how music was made. Not just how it was presented to you, but all of this affects how people made music. Now, this is what made the Beatles so revolutionary. They were the first people to look at an album and say, hey, this is a new musical form. Or the first people to popularly do that. An album before that was literally that. It was a collection of singles. You didn't get an album unless you had enough hit singles to justify an album. So the Beatles were the first people to actually sell albums as albums, to make the music on an album worth as much as the music that came out on singles. This was epiphanal for people. And it threw everyone into a whole tizzy, and it completely changed the way the music business did rules, and it completely changed what radio was like. And this became what is now known as the golden age of radio. Since these rules were being destroyed so completely and arbitrarily. In other words, once the Beatles did it, everybody was doing it, and suddenly they were interbreeding musical styles. You had classical rock and jazz rock and country rock and all of these other sort of, you know, inbred, miscegenated musical ideas that people took at their face value as totally legitimate. And the radio would take it as legitimate. So you would listen to the radio. And the Beatles, not only were the Beatles, they were your vehicle to discover the whole world of music. And you would hear a Beatles song next to some folk rock, Bob Dylan song or something like that, next to a Jimmy Smith song, next to some other kind of obscure, weird music. And that's why so many of the people of my generation look back in the 70s and say, wasn't music much better then? Well, maybe it was not that much better, but there was still new music to be discovered, and there was still avenues to discover it, free and open enough, and confident enough that they wouldn't compromise their commerciality by playing something that already hadn't been measured in terms of audience response. So that started sometime around 1965, 66. And college radio became as legitimate as regular commercial radio because it was as free as anyone to play all this new music that was being imported by carloads from Europe and particularly from England, all these new bands who probably didn't deserve the attention but got it on the coattails of the Beatles. Then, what happened? You know, it looked like things were really going to be great. You know, you're going to listen to the radio and just be exposed to new musical ideas all the time, and there was new freedom to put anything you wanted on this format, you know, this new expanded format, and do segues between songs, construct your own sort of operas. You know, the Who went off and did that Drek Tommy thing, you know, because people were willing to suck up anything in those days. And it was just a very interesting period. Anyway, what happened to all this? Well, one thing that happened that kind of like took the wind out of it, I suppose, and this is something that just occurred to me now. So you're watching a process, people. Is that synthesizers appeared and took the dominance away from the guitars. And this had some visceral effect. This created that kind of gray area where all of this very serious music by people like ELP and Yes and King Crimson and Gentle Giant and Soft Machine and all of the other people, the only ones that survived were probably Pink Floyd. But this was a giant phenomenon at the time. You would go to a concert and listen to people play for 4 or 5 hours of this, you know, and they would play a godzillion notes during those 4 or 5 hours. I can't understand how people could stand it, but that's what we did in those days. I guess the drugs helped. In any case, that was not the thing, though, that really started to kill this, you know, creative development of music and the expansion of radio. The thing that killed that was something called the Arbitron rating system. Now, when record companies were a lot of independents, you know, there weren't so many, it wasn't so much all just the majors, the 6 majors that we know of today, and I can't enumerate them, and I won't, because it's like, you know, reciting the keys to the apocalypse. The original record business was a lot of little independents, you know, who based their success on development of a particular artist or in some sort of something they consider almost sort of magical, some magical element in the music that would appeal to people. People playing the music on the radio didn't really know. The people making the music didn't really know. They left it up to the audience. You know, they'd play something on the radio and then the phones would light up and you'd know it was a hit. That really wasn't good enough anymore. People were selling such volumes of records after the Beatles came out. I mean, any 4 people who could get together and learn how to play instruments suddenly became a band. This was ubiquitous. Before that, you said, oh, hey, I'm going to like graduate high school and get into a band. Your parents would just like, you know, this is suicide for you. Suddenly, you know, by the end of the 60s, you know, like this is a legitimate career move now. You know, you're going to get in a band and you may make $1 million because there was so much demand for this kind of music. With this kind of demand, you know, the radio stations and the record companies figure, you know, wouldn't it be much easier for us if we could predict what the audience wants and make what the audience wants in the same way that any other manufacturing concern would go out and do market studies, you know, and then make the things that they thought people wanted so that they wouldn't wind up with all this excess inventory and returns and stuff like that. So what they did was they applied Madison Avenue market study techniques to the music business. In other words, when whatever they used to sell soap or cosmetics or cigarettes or liquor or anything else, they used those same techniques, applied them to the music business, and they developed what they call the Arbitron rating system. And what this involves is you get a bunch of people, what you consider a typical listening audience. You interview some people according to whatever criteria. I don't know what they are. Something secret like Scientology. And you sit these people down in a room and you play records for them. And you wire them up to get their, you know, galvanic skin responses and give them little dials to turn. You know, I'm getting off, I'm not getting off, I'm hating it, you know, this kind of thing. And they would put a record on. Record companies would, before they released the record, send the Arbitron Corporation the 2 or 3 songs they consider releasing for singles and get the ratings back. And depending on what the number was, you get a number for that. You know, it's like getting graded in school. It would be somewhere between 50 and 100, and if you got below 50, don't even think about it. And then record companies would decide, based on that number, what they would release and promote. So suddenly, somewhere in the early 70s, this became the way to develop and release music. And my record company used to do it. It cost money. You know, they cost them $10,000 to get a number back for how successful this record is expected to be with audiences. But they would also use this number and say, you know, give it to a radio station, say, look at the numbers we got here. Your audience is going to love this, guaranteed. So what does this do? It means that those 20, 30 people who are listening to all the music are suddenly determining what you will hear. A room full of people will determine everything that you hear. And the effect of this cannot be underestimated. It affected the entire music industry. The next factor that helped to enforce that system was the independent promotion gimmick. You can read around here what happened to Alan Freed somewhere on one of these floors, just completely bedazzled by the volume of stuff here, but somewhere you'll find the history of Alan Freed, who is considered the father of rock and roll in that he completely devoted his radio career popularizing the music, but also he was subject to some federal investigations and prosecutions because of what they call payola, which was, and I don't necessarily see what's wrong with this considering everything else that goes on, but somebody from a record company would come in and pay him to play a record. And probably wasn't so bad that he played it, but that he would proclaim it's a hit, you know? So like, this is a great record, like, pay him for his opinion, I suppose. But in any case, you know, he must have had some success in getting records popularized because eventually the feds got him and busted him. And they broke up the payola system. In other words, it became illegal to pay somebody to play a record. Directly, that is. A record company couldn't pay them to play a record. Now, what the record company can do is hire an independent promotion man, pay him a bounty for every one of these stations that he gets. And then the independent promotion man comes in and buys the prostitutes and the fur coats and the cocaine and stuff like that for the program director. And in other words, they rarely give him cash. They give him stuff that the program director would be spending his cash on. And that gets your record on the air. And that eventually wound up in some kind of federal investigation in the late 70s, early 80s. And there's a book about that if you want to read it. But essentially, this is what the Arbitron rating system and the independent promotion system did to music. But perhaps more damaging than that was an event called Frampton Comes Alive. Not the Beatles, not the Rolling Stones, not even Neil Diamond. Sold as many records as Frampton Comes Alive. This was the advent of the multi-platinum record, something nobody had ever heard of before. And then in short order, you know, and it was very much tied to this live thing. I mean, Peter Frampton, you know, he was a expatriate of a so-called supergroup called The Herd that put out about 2 or 3 albums in England, never did anything else in the anywhere else in the world. Came to the United States, had a few minor, you know, like radio hits, and just like toured constantly. And this was a live album. And suddenly after this, you know, it was like Bob Seger and everyone's putting out these live albums and going multi-platinum. And suddenly it was multi-platinum media. And what was the next thing to happen? All the multinationals came in and started buying up all the record labels, making them subsidiaries of Gulf and Western, you know, like an oil company. And so what happened after that was that the ledger sheets of the record companies were then examined by accountants who were working for these multinational conglomerates, you know, who were making things like steel, you know, and refining oil, stuff like that. And they would look at the vinyl and they say, Van Morrison, who is this guy? He's only selling 80,000 albums. Drop him. And so, like, Warner Brothers dropped Van Morrison because of a decision that got made in some multinational office somewhere. This eventually became the modus operandi of record companies. Since they were all owned by multinational corporations, they would be preemptive. Hey, before you get in trouble, you know, for supporting an artist, well, dump them yourself before the accounting office comes down and tells them. So this really affected the kind of artists and what you would see and the sort of packaged nature. Now, after that, there were all of those other more obvious things that happened, like MTV and the glaring realization that music video was not going to turn out to be a new expressive medium. It was going to turn out to be commercials for records. And other developments, you know, the various musical styles that have come and gone. But it's generally gotten to the point where rock and roll, as we call it, is a lightweight term as applied to current music, to popular music. After all, rap has very little to do with rock and roll. Let me give you a secret of rock and roll. There. And and there are other forms of music that may or may not be called rock and roll, and you know, the previous kind of new wave, previously mentioned new wave music or whatever that stuff was. And punk rock, which even, you know, which tried as much as possible to undershoot whatever rock and roll was, or to become some kind of primitive precursor to whatever rock and roll was. So there were certain musical styles. But in terms of, I think, the dilemma that faces record companies, that faces radio, and all those people who make their money off of music, and you know, of course, artists as well, came about because of a revolution in that other area, the Thomas Alva Edison recording, transcription, playback area, and that was, well, there are two factors, but I'm going to concentrate on one because it means more to you. That was the advent of the Walkman. The fact that you could have a personal listening experience anywhere you were. And you probably didn't notice what this did to your attitude about music, but it used to be, like for instance in the 60s, the good old days, when a new record would come out. Well, I don't need these, do I? Like for instance, a new Beatles record or Sgt. Pepper. This became like, you know, this is like you went to school. You would go home, you would lock the door and shutter the windows and take the telephone off the hook, you know, and you would listen to this record once through with great reverence because this was like a sermon. You know, your first listening of this was so epiphanal that, you know, that you had to like sit there and listen to this with great reverence, and then you might listen to it 5 times in a row without interruption and deduce all this stuff. You know, your life, these were guiding principles of your life. Then suddenly you had this device that would allow you to listen to music anywhere you were, or no matter what you were doing. You'd be out jogging somewhere, or you might be on the subway reading and listening to a record at the same time. Suddenly music would move from this quality time experience, something you could only experience in your own home. If you wanted to listen to a certain artist, you know, and under certain circumstances, you had to create those circumstances. That was no longer necessary. You could listen to this music anywhere you were. And what does that do to your personal economics regarding the music? Well, you don't have to go into any trouble anymore. You know, the music is servicing you now. You are not going to any effort to create an environment for the music. So people's attitudes about music has changed. It has completed the evolution to a total consumer product at that point. There's no pretenses to art, no pretenses to having a hold on your consciousness any longer. And therefore, music has evolved from something that had its own agenda to something that services your agenda. Something that's appropriate to what you're doing, whether it happens to be dancing or exercising or having dinner or cleaning the house or some other thing. And you all have to admit that your listening habits have changed accordingly. That when a new album comes out, you don't sit there with reverence and listen to the whole thing. You put the thing on and engage in some other activity and wait for a song to merit your attention. And then when you finally find a song that merits your attention, you go over and copy it off onto a cassette along with the other songs that merited your attention. And you never go back to that entire experience that vain artist thought you were going to sit down there and listen to all the way through. So what does that mean for the music business in general and artists, you know, for me, people like that? Well, there's no point in trying to go back and relive history. Once things get discovered, you can't undiscover them. You know, we're not going to undiscover the Walkman. We're not going to undiscover computers. We're not going to undiscover consumerism. What's going to happen is that maybe artists and technologists who are going to develop new delivery systems will discover how to satisfy that change in people. In other words, I'm not condemning you for having this attitude about music, because music used to have to justify its place in people's lives. It used to have political relevance to you. In other words, songs that had any life, they had life because they were constantly being updated with new verses. You know, bar songs that they sung in the old pubs of England, you know, and once some political figure, some member of the royal family would create a particularly delicious faux pas, that would become a new verse for the song. That's why fraternity music will never go away. You know, it's why the Kingsmen will always should have their statues at the top of this building here, you know, for Louie Louie, because it all pyramids down from Louie Louie, because it actually does have a function. It's for you to be in a frat party drunk out of your mind and be able to sing anything you want and not be incorrect. So music is getting back to its role of fulfilling something in your life, which doesn't mean it can't fulfill that desire to sit down and block out everything else and have the music define your entire experience. But the problem is that people who make music and want to make money off of music, it's too complicated for that. You know, they'd rather have a format. The radio format is the reason why radio is going to go away. Radio as we know it. because they always want a format. They want something that defines you so that they can service you. But unfortunately, you're too used to having your agenda filled by all these other media. The Walkman, the ability to have your own customized album eventually designed for you. And that's why we're moving into the new phase of music, the music of the future, which will have something to do with the internet or something like that, interactive television. Here's this basic myth that all of us will eventually get over, but has been fostered by the music business, sometimes to their own chagrin. The idea that you can own music, the idea that this plastic disc is somehow means that you own the music on it. You don't own the music on it. The disc, as anyone who's in the music business will eventually break down and tell you, is a license to listen to the music. And so it's just simply a convenience, a way of delivering the music to you so that you can put it in a device so that sound will come out of the speakers, because that's the product. The sound coming out of the speakers, not the disc. And so what's the difference between delivering the music to you through a wire that eventually connects directly to your speakers, or pressing it onto a disc, which requires, dredging up oil and killing trees and polluting the air to transport it around to the record store and all this other stuff? I can tell you as an artist, I'm perfectly willing to let all that stuff go, no matter what kind of romantic attraction I've had to the album with the lovely graphics and things like that. We got to kill trees to make those things. You got to burn gas to drive it around to the record store so that you can drive your car to go to the record store to get that thing, to eventually get it to your house so you can listen to it. So in the future, the way you'll get music, ideally, will be to describe what you want and have some intelligent agent go out on the internet or your interactive television system, bring back what you want and play it for you and give you the experience that you want when you want it, because that in the end is what music has always been about. Music is about plugging into your life in one way or another. There may have been times when music was potent, important enough in a certain way because we'd forgotten certain things and music reminded us or whatever, to become more than that, to become a social nexus in the way it was in the 60s, the way it is for people who are devotees of rap music or grunge music. But in the main, what music is really supposed to do is plug into your life somehow. And the future of music will be about what you want, when you want it, and processes, systems that go out and find that for you. That doesn't require the artist to change his agenda. The artist can still decide, I want to please you. The artist can decide, I want to please myself. That doesn't prevent you from finding them in the way that the music business does. The music business first decides, well, Mr. Artist, that may please you, but it won't please anyone else, so we're not going to make that record. Or they may decide, okay, well, you've got a right to, to appeal to the audience, but we've got a whole bunch of radio programmers and MTV programmers to please first. So unless you modify what you do to appeal to them, you'll never get to the audience. Or then you could step on to the next phase, which is, we can't sell it to people unless people in retail are inclined to buy the record and stick it in the stores where people can find it. So, we're going to have to do stuff to suck up to them. Meanwhile, every step of this process is adding to the cost of the music, which is passed on to you, the consumer. Why should you have to pay the $15 to listen to that one song that caught your attention in the end? So this is the way the music business is going, I declare it. And I think that's probably as much as I have to say. And if anyone has any questions about what I've said, let's get into it now. There you go.
All right, you mentioned bands like the Beatles and Elvis and Ravel and stuff like that. What bands from, say, 1990 on do you see people talking about in 20 years?
1990 on. I have to say that the last time I thought a band seriously knew where they were in the great scheme of things is probably U2. And when they did the Zoo TV tour and stuff like that, they were a band that enjoyed the position that a band like the Beatles or somebody enjoyed through flogging the same kind of music over and over. And they decided, here we are at the height of our popularity, we don't have to change, but we are going to change. And we're going to absorb new ideas and new information, change our music and change the way we present it. And I have to say that I think it was the right thing for them to do, and that they did it in the right way. In other words, they didn't make crappy dilettante, well, sometimes they make crappy dilettante music like that stupid Batman song. But aside from that, it didn't seriously damage their music. It made their music interesting in some ways. And they changed their mode of presentation in an aggressive way that I thought gave a lot of people new ideas, and I had a lot of respect for them in that sense.
Do you honestly think that the disc itself and the toolbox with the artwork and all is agree with it or something not true at all?
Honestly do.
Do you honestly do?
The disc, the box, well, the disc itself is only a vehicle delivered. Nobody has any great love of the disc. Some people may have some great love of vinyl. I mean, I love vinyl, particularly when you could make it in different colors and clear so you could look through it, because that's some of my first musical experiences. My parents had these, I guess it was RCA or Capitol. RCA put out the first record player, very smart marketing move. They put out the first 45 multi-disc player. It was a little thing that only played 45s and a big, like, phallic-looking thing. It actually had a red top on it. And you would stack up your singles on there, and it would play a stack of singles. Then you could take the whole stack off, flip them over, and play the other sides of them. And that was my initial experience, and all the records that my parents bought and the ones that went with them, they were light classics by the Boston Pops, like Chicken Reel and the Skater's Waltz, and they would be printed on, like, pressed in red and blue and green and yellow vinyl, and you could look through them and listen to the music. And this to me was multimedia. You would look through the colored vinyl and listen to, da 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 da, da da. It just, it was totally transportive. And that's the only reason why I like the vinyl. And those didn't even have sleeves. They would, had those little, generic brown paper sleeve with a hole in the middle so you could see the label. As far as the graphics go, you make the graphics a product. Everyone rued the day when they went from graphics this size to graphics this size, where everyone insisted in printing the lyrics in type so small you couldn't possibly read it to save your life. So I think, yeah, there'll be actual products for those graphics. People do buy the graphs. They go to poster stores and buy posters of the bands, and they buy the photo albums of the bands to get the fuller graphic experience. It's, it is difficult to get it into a form factor that size, but I think that the shortcomings of that will be just another reason why the CD will go away eventually.
What do you see happening with commercial radio and the major labels? I mean, how do you see this evolutionary process affecting
Commercial radio, the major labels are all completely pissing themselves because of the things I've enumerated to you here. Somebody can get on the internet now and start their own radio station, and it isn't too difficult to be better than most of the radio that's out there. Once you get out of those, formatting strictures and trying to please advertisers all the time, and to constantly hit some kind of demographic, and you're always worried about drive time and morning drive time, afternoon time, and all the other ridiculous things that go into radio formatting. Direct, what we call point casting, is going to become the next big thing. Somebody down the block from you may be doing a better radio station than the guys downtown, and you'll be able to hear that because you're connected to the same sort of network that they're connected to. So the idea is for you to describe what you want, have some mechanism find it for you, and have somebody out there making it for you. And you'd be surprised how easy it is to get, an equivalent listenership when you're not talking about simply the people in town during drive time. You're talking about the entire world. You're talking about everybody in the world all the time. As far as record companies, the same damn thing. I have taken pains over the past 3-4 years to extract myself from every contract I ever had with a record company or a publisher, because I'm going to be able to deliver what I do directly to people on their terms or my terms. I don't have to worry about the terms of the record company, the terms of the musicians union, the terms of Blockbuster, the terms of MTV. I can make up my own terms, and it's between me and the audience.
Do you think that the independents are going to get buried, or do you think that they're going to thrive under this whole new cyber pipeline type of deal?
Independents are only there to provide a stepping stone for artists who are not ready, let's say, to get onto a major label.
Do you think the spoon feeding's over?
What's that?
Do you think the whole spoon feeding thing is over?
Well, there's a great deal of ambivalence, I feel, in the independent scene, the so-called independent scene. There's that independent music had a great deal of association with the ego or the self-image of people moving from high school to college. The music produced by independents usually services those people directly. And it has a lot to do with your self-image, you know, and the way you and your friends try and come off, you know, as being hip or as being, you know, the whole idea of independent music sometimes was being able to go to a party with your friends and quote a whole bunch of bands that they never heard of. You know, oh, you never heard of, you know, like Squeaking Shoes, man? They're the greatest. What's wrong with you, man? They're just like the most happening thing. Of course, like 3 weeks later, the band's gone, you know. But the whole idea of the independent scene was how hip can you possibly be? But for any bands, you know, who are serious about music, wanted to make a living at music, they couldn't make a living on these labels. They're just a stepping stone to get into a major label. So in that sense, anyone who lasts in the music business has to realize that cynicism is a part of the job, like in politics. You can't be a politician and not resign yourself to lying.
You talked some about how music will be delivered and the internet. A lot of people, just because of lifestyle, listen a lot to music in their cars, either on the radio or whatever. Do you ever foresee the time when, or does the technology exist today, where you can actually, through cellular communications or whatever, access the internet in your car and create your own radio station?
Well, all of it, any of that is technologically feasible today. One thing you could do is, for instance, and this probably you may see this appear in the next year or so, if I have anything to do with it. You've got one of these new interactive TV services. You got a cable modem into your house. Essentially, the cable box that you have in your house, there's so much information going into it that you can actually use it as an interactive device because you got like, what, 100 channels of cable and stuff coming into the house. So when you're not watching a television, you can use that box for other things. Or you could use the box to deliver other kinds of data much faster than you get it down your 28.8 modem or your 14.4 modem. So they'll use that device as a way to convey computer or digitized information into the house. So you'll go to sleep. A little menu will come up on your TV and you'll say, give me that song, that song, that song, that song, and that song. You pop a writable CD-ROM into the cable modem. You go to sleep, and the next morning you got a custom CD with only the music that you want on it, and then you go out in your car and play it there. That's what you can do now. Technologically you can do now. Within the next 5 years, they're going to have point casting to people, what they call cellular modem. High bandwidth cellular modem has allowed people to broadcast to you as if you are your own, as if you had your own satellite dish on your car while you're driving around. And you can demand customized radio like DMX in your car. Radio that's to your specifications, not to somebody else's. And that'll be the final question. Okay.
Doesn't that tend to homogenize and destroy the regionality of local music scenes? And can't radio fill that role?
Local music scenes are only local before they hit the recording process, before they hit that mainstream recording thing. They're local because the bands mostly perform live. Nothing prevents them from continuing to perform live. Everyone who's in a band, their biggest dream is not to be local, by the way. Their dream is to become international. So, maybe you want them to be local, but the band is not satisfied with being local. They want to be international. So, no, it won't affect the local scene at all. This is how bands get started. It's how they learn how to play their instruments, at your expense. You go pay to see them play somewhere, and they're going to learn how to get their fingers in those chords right in front of you. So, no, that's no danger of that disappearing. In fact, you'll probably wish it disappeared before it disappears. Anyway, thanks a lot, everyone. Enjoy